And I see what happens when people stick with the protocol. Major changes. Well, if you can help all kinds of conditions in all areas, then it shows you what we've been missing in the American psyche is a whole sense of preventativeness. You know, taking responsibility to prevent something before it happens. It's like we want to put people in a Maserati and never give them a driver or a safety lesson and hope they don't wreck. Well, when we don't practice prevention in lifestyle, behavior, diet, and exercise, then what in the world can reasonably be the outcome except we're going to get sick? And then either we justify our sickness, make excuses for our sickness, or we adapt to it, in which case nothing ever gets better. You're never going to feel better, never going to look better, never going to look younger. Or you decide, this isn't working, let's do something that will really make a difference, and you start to change. Now, the hardest part of this program is in the initial few steps, because that's when most people are up against all those old voices saying, eat the hamburger. Bury your face in those French fries, right? Have the cigarette. Start to gossip again. You know, listen to the negative news. See who's been burned to death or shot, or you need that, right? Yeah, no, you don't need that. And you don't need the French fries, you don't need the hamburger. But once, and until you're really confident of who you're doing this for, at any given moment, you can take the exit and go right back to where you were. But you've been there, you've done that. You've taken too many exits in your life, never got to where you're going. And when you did, you didn't even know why you got there. How many times have you worked so hard to get a goal, and you get the goal, then you wake up and say, I thought I was supposed to feel better having all this work and getting this goal. I don't feel any better having achieved this. Now I got to do something else. Perpetual goals. Well, it was because the wrong person was taking the journey to the goal. So we want to stop that and say, what do we have to do to get in touch with the real self? So that's what this program is about. It's about resolving conflict, preventing the wrong choices from being made in the first place, and living a happy, healthy, balanced life. Otherwise, it's going to be chronic turmoil. And disease is merely an extension. It is a symptom of a body and mind and spirit that are not balanced. Now, when we learn how to cleanse the system, which we've been doing with the juices, the green juices, and we know that the chlorophyll is the great blood cleanser, and we know the phytochemicals, the plant chemicals from the vegetable family and the fruit family will not only help prevent viruses and bacteria and yeast and molds from manifesting in our system and doing the damage, but we also know that many of the phytochemicals are specific to help the cells. Now, they help the DNA of the cell. What that means is they can actually take a cell that has been damaged, and some of your specialized cells, once you've damaged it, they stay damaged forever, and it becomes your weak link. And that weak link is ultimately what brings you down. So let's say you say, well, Gary, why did I get lung cancer? I stopped smoking 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Yes, good. But the damage that was done 10 and 20 years ago is still there. It's the weak link. Now, granted, a good diet can slow down additional disease process. Stress management can slow down disease. Exercise can slow down disease. Cleaning up your home and work environment can slow down disease, but it cannot reverse it. Not your major disease, not those that are done on the cellular level. Now, that requires something additional. I mean, could you imagine going over to, a car that you ran against a wall at 80 miles an hour with a tiny little hammer and trying to knock out all the dents? You can't do it. What you got to do is you got to apply a level, therapeutic level, that is different than the preventative level. Now, I came up with a little system. Again, it's my own system, therefore it is subjective. And here's how it works. Let's say 0 is no disease, and 100 is death. I have found that most illnesses really only manifest major symptoms at around 40 to 50 on that scale. Now, once you get the symptom, like you got the arthritis, or you've got the high blood pressure, you've got, a tumor, you're at 40 to 50. And it requires an energy to continue the disease process going. It fuels on something. It fuels on imbalance or infection and inflammation and dysregulation, metabolic dysfunction, all the different things, biooxidative dysfunction, free radical pathology. All these conditions cause the disease process. Now, if you do not pay it attention, if you don't say, okay, I've got a disease process going on here, what do I do about it? It just keeps gradually going up. And then when you start getting up in the 70s and 80s, then you're really getting disabled. Now it's changed the quality of life, where every day when you wake up, you really know that the disease is there. And it takes on a fear. The fear that you're going to be disabled, or the fear you're going to die. I mean, if you're a man and you've got an enlarged prostate, and your doctor says, hey, we got to go in there and take it out, which could cause impotency, or we got to put radiation pellets in there, and that can cause impotency, and also it causes, low-level radiation poisoning, which can cause other conditions. You're not going to be thinking, oh, what a great day it is. I feel good today. Even though I might be dying, I feel good today. Your whole mind's going to be focused on this prostate gland. And if a woman's got breast cancer, you think she's not going to think about it? Of course she's going to think about it. But when you think about something, you give it energy. You give it power. Whatever you think about, you give power. Now the question is, what kind of thought have you given the condition? Have you given it fear? That will enhance the disease process because it creates stress hormones, and the stress hormones speed up the disease process. Or have you given it optimism? This is a gift. My disease is a gift. And through this gift, I will grow. I will learn that I allowed a conflict to occur. I created a conflict. I made inappropriate choices, and my gift is this disease. So I'm not going to be angry at myself. I'm going to forgive myself. And I'm not going to be all upset because I've been upset. And by being upset, either internalizing it or externalizing it or sublimating it, I've not paid attention to my own health, and this is the outcome. Not for all conditions, of course, but for a lot. So now I'm going to pay attention, but I'm going to give not the disease the attention, but my life the attention. So I'm going to give no conflict any power. When I don't feed a conflict, it doesn't have the power to continue. Instead, I'm going to give my energy into wellness. Each day, my life will be what I give my attention to. I'm going to look for the most positive, life-affirming, self-actualizing way of dealing with everything. So at the end of this day, I will have done nothing to allow this breast cancer, prostate cancer, to grow. Now, people can be cynical and say, well, that doesn't matter, but I can show you thousands of articles in the scientific literature from psychoneuroimmunology and other areas showing that every thought you have immediately corresponds to how your body chemistry is affected. Negative thoughts, fearful thoughts, angry thoughts, negative. Positive thoughts, optimistic thoughts, joyful thoughts, spiritual thoughts, positive. So now here we are. We're thinking, and that thinking allows our system to go down or to go up on the disease side. Now, once you start getting up around 90, you're at the end stage of a disease process. You're really sick. And 100 is death. Now, on the other side, 0 is no health, and 100 is total health. And through my travels throughout the world, I want to see what allows an individual to be healthy, not only in our culture, but other cultures. And I found that there are beneficial understandings from every culture. For example, in many cultures, just being able to sit with your family for a period of each day is very healing. To take the issues that you want to share and the joy of being with people you care about, that's very rewarding. But how often in our society today do we sit down as a family for quality, undistracted time? I mean, be honest. Does it happen very often? No, it doesn't. More often than not, everyone in the family's got something else they're doing. You'd like to do it, but the reality is you don't, and not consistently. You can't tell me when the last time you had dinner with your family, quiet, uninterrupted, joyful, 7 days a week. Right? You're thinking 7 days a week, Gary. Try once a month. Got to make a reservation with your family. And that's all right, as long as we understand there's a consequence to it. And I found that when people have quiet time, now in other societies, they really do enjoy that peace of mind that comes from doing nothing, working in a garden. When I was in England, I went around the English countryside. Now, the English are not wealthy people. A middle-class, American middle-class English person, the American has more than the English materialistically. But I saw some things they did that we could learn something from. And again, it's not to accept the whole thing, but look at parts. And I saw the people love gardening there. And they have some wonderful gardens. I mean, average people in a backyard have gardens that just are magnificent because they give it energy. They love it, they tend to it, and you talk with them, and I did. And they would talk about how it took 10 years to grow this one, area up, so it has a certain look to it, a Shakespearean garden. And we're talking about people in the daytime might work, as a railroad conductor or work in a supermarket, but this is one of the things they do to rebalance their life. They're seeking positive things to rebalance. They like the quiet, they like nature, they like the time alone where they can relax, where they don't have to do anything or prove anything to anyone, just themselves. Well, I got to ask you, how many of you each day find quality time and make quality time to spend just with yourself? No phones, no responsibilities, no beepers, just you alone with yourself. Doesn't happen very often, does it? No. Maybe on a weekend sometimes, but then you got television and phones and responsibilities and so many things to do, you're just not on that to-do list. So think about those cultures that they do put themselves up there. In Italy, a lot of people spend time making wine, tending to their grapes and their gardens and their herbs. And food is a very big part of their culture. And I was amazed at how lacking in obesity they were for as much food as they focus on. You'd think they'd be obese, they're not. Very healthy by and large, and living longer lives. More importantly, there seems to be a joy in many of them that we don't often see here. And then I look at the urban environment in almost every city, London, Paris, Rome, Frankfurt, Toronto, and then New York, LA, around our country. Almost all the same. Too few hours to do too many things, too many goals with too much pressure, too many responsibilities, and too little time for self. And I don't care where you're at in the world, it's all the same. Then you go into the countryside, and if you were to go upstate, and we're in New York State now, if you were to go upstate around Kingston and that area, New Paltz, and you'd find small farms and people relaxing. People today will be tending their gardens, sitting on the swings, petting their animals, watching the bees and butterflies. They're trapping a moment. They're saying what in this moment is important, and the butterfly is important, just like a kid. They'll watch it, and they'll find joy in it. And knowing that a tree is going to give them some plums or some apples, they just keep watching the process, and they have the patience to wait until it's right, and then they'll go out and they'll pick. And imagine the joy of just picking an apple. And we never think of that because we just go and there's 300 apples, right? And 15 varieties. We put them on our case and go home and eat them. But would it make a difference if we also saw the apple growing and maturing in the moment when it was there for us? All we had to do is simply be present. It did it on its own. We take the apple and the energy of that apple and the energy around, and we brought it into ourselves. That is what's missing when you build a life of concrete and steel and glass and noise and congestion, and then we wonder what is missing. The essentialness of the subtle, the necessary of the quiet, the sublime of the humility we must maintain in the face and magnificence of nature. Sitting. My uncle used to have a little goldfish pole, and it was tiny. It was maybe just this big, that's all. But there were little goldfish in there, and he had kind of aromatic flowers like lavender, lilac, ginger, jasmine. So you'd sit there and he'd have wonderful smells all the time. And it was in his backyard, just a regular little backyard. But he did this backyard so nicely, and that was his hobby. And so he'd sit there, and I'd go out and I was a little kid, and I'd sit there with him. And he'd feed the fish, and I'd feed the fish, and I'd like to watch the fish. And you forget that hours go by just doing this, doing nothing. And as a kid, my aunt had little pictures of, they looked like they were from the 18th and 19th century, of little kittens playing and dogs. You know which ones I'm talking about, where they're little Cocker Spaniels? They came from another century. And then they also had these bucolic scenes, like a French countryside out of the 1700s. And I thought, what would it be like to live back then, to have that, where you woke up each day and you had a knowledge of what your life would be like. They had a lot of hardships. Not everything was as nice as we'd like it to be. It's always nicer when you look at a picture and don't have to live it sometimes. But there's also a lot that they did have that we don't have. Quality time, the one thing they had. Last night, when I got back from doing a lecture, I was listening to one of the C-SPAN channels, and a man was reading a letter from Thomas Jefferson to another man who had a daughter die. And it was a long, very wonderful letter, beautiful letter, the kind of letter that men don't write today. The lack of proper vocabulary, the lack of respecting the language, the lack of using words as tools. Think of how, when you hear a movie today, think how much guttural language you hear, how much profanity, and how little use of language to heighten a screenplay. We think it's wonderful. We just hear a screenplay today, see a movie that, where they're not insulting us by showing us how limited they are in the use of a language. It's as if, all right, whatever's out on the street, whatever a 14-year-old talks about, that's the language of the movies today. Well, what about those of us who don't want that language? Maybe we were there, don't need to be there ever again. We do grow, but as a culture, we're kind of shrinking down. That affects us. A person who graduated from the 5th grade 100 years ago had the equivalent of 10th grade education today. We were more wise in our education, better disciplined, better schooled in those little red schoolhouses than we are today with our floating standards. All that will impact upon the values and standards and the fulfillment and happiness that comes in what makes us go up to live a longer, healthier life. So when I looked around at what really makes you live a longer life, it's not just your nutrition, it's not the vitamins you take, it's not the exercise. Nutrition, if it's perfect, represents 15%. Perfect nutrition is 15%. Okay? Vitamins, juicing, 10%. Now you're 25. Exercise and stress management together, 25. Your belief systems, 50%. Listen again. Your belief systems represent a more important model of health and longevity and vitality and disease prevention than diet, supplements, juicing, exercise, and stress put together. Because I saw cultures where they didn't juice, didn't take vitamins, didn't eat organic garden food, weren't big in any systematic exercise, and they lived longer, healthier lives than we do because they were happier. And happiness doesn't come through your nutrition, juicing, vitamins, exercise, or stress management. Happiness comes from what you value and how you're going to live a life that maintains that value. So here, there was a time when we had values that were different than today. Life was simpler, in some respects more difficult, but when I grew up, I never had a car, so I ran everywhere. I thought nothing of running, to my buddy's house and going to school, and I just ran everywhere. Well, that helped me, but at the time I didn't appreciate it. Today I do. I didn't appreciate my mother wouldn't let us watch television except on Saturday morning. When we watched the big Howdy Doody and Big Top, or Big, Seal Test. Yeah, we watched that. And we'd listen to radio, Jack Benny and some of these things. But all during the week, you did your homework, we had dinner together, and we talked, and we did hobbies, and socialized. And there were times when I didn't want to do that. I'm glad that I did do that. We can't always appreciate how much wisdom there is in something when we're fighting it at the moment because we want to do something else. Well, what about those cultures today where they still don't drive everywhere, don't spend 5.5 hours watching television, 2.5 hours talking on the phone, snacking all day long on unhealthy snacks? Those are the people living healthier lives. Have any of you seen that Discovery documentary they did about, I think, 1.5 years, 2 years ago, because I've seen it run a few times, where it was down in South America in the rainforest, and that showed a tribe that used the long dart guns, and there was a guy that went after monkeys to eat, and he was climbing the trees, and he went out for 4 days. Pure muscle body, was 66 years old. He had the body of like an 18-year-old, and not even a regular 18-year-old. I mean, muscular. He would just jump right up those trees, and he was so patient, and he'd come back after 3 or 4 days with the monkeys that he had gotten. And he knew what his role in life was and his place, and there was balance, and there was harmony. Well, show me a 67-year-old guy climbing trees today. They can't climb into bed today. That's true. We have to understand that other cultures have benefited from conveniences they frequently do not have. And we have been weakened by having too many conveniences. And our big weaknesses came when my parents, born in the Depression and healthy up through the end of the Second World War, then ended up being sold the idea that if they wanted to have a happy life, they had to have one of convenience. So frozen dinners and instant dinners and microwave cooking and mixing everything in a box for them. That became the way you were supposed to do things. You wanted everything convenience. Remember those tacky things in the 50s where you push a button, everything was done for you? Of course, it always broke, but that ushered in a whole industry of servicing everything that you thought you had to have that breaks. And then people stopped doing things for themselves because why should you? Have it done for you. And our parents' generation worked very hard. We've never worked as hard as they worked. And when we started seeing our mothers and fathers smoking and drinking, social drinking, and eating the way they did, it was inevitable that they'd all get sick. And it was inevitable that they'd all be dying at a certain time. Now, they didn't have the benefit of what we had, and that is understanding how lifestyle does affect your behavior, but their parents did. So their parents, if they didn't die of some infectious disease or some lack of sanitation with purified water, they lived long lives. So you almost have to go back to the Civil War generation where people were still self-sufficient, where a farmer would grow 100 variety of things on a farm, everything they needed. They had root cellars that were 5 feet underground so that their tubers, like sweet potatoes and yams and potatoes and apples and beets and carrots and onions and garlic, would be kept 12 months a year at 55 degrees. They would take beeswax and melt the beeswax and then wipe it around things to preserve them. Today we use paraffin wax, which causes cancer. They had dairy cows that were never fed any both hormone, and the milk was not pasteurized or homogenized. And they would make a cheese, which pasteurized it, and they would hang it, coat it in generally a bee propolis, which kept bacteria off of it, and they would hang it in barns, and they would have the cheese racks. And my farm upstate, which was built in 1671, the original barn was there, and I saw all the things where they used to hang them, and they even had a smokehouse where they'd take a pit and they'd make a pit about 3 feet deep, about 12 feet around, and then they would hang hooks, and they'd go out and get venison, like a deer, and they'd skin it down, and then they'd put the venison up there, and they'd brush it with a salt water on a like a big swab, and they'd soak it, and the salt and the water draws out all the moisture. So, and then they have a low heat, hickory, and the hickory would dry it from the down up, and the salt would bring it out. So you were bringing out the salt, putting the salt on and bringing out the water, and then the water was being dried by the heat. So you'd take a 300-pound deer, and in a period of 2 weeks, it would be down to just a pure jerk. That's what they call them, a jerky. That's where the pulling off piece of meat, that's where the term jerky came from. And that might weigh 60 pounds, 50 pounds when they were finished with it, 40 pounds. And then they would coat that in honey, and it would stay for a long time, year, 2 years. So if they had to travel, that's how they got across the country. They had all this dried meat and dried pork and dried beef and dried venison, rabbit and everything, and then they would just hydrate it, put it in water, and make a stew. That's why stews were a big deal, because you could keep it for long periods of time, and then you put your pot and your stew and your vegetables, and then it would rehydrate it back. Well, they had the smokehouses. They didn't kill their cows because the cows were animals that gave milk and cheese and yogurt or kefir. They also had vegetable gardens where they would dry their vegetables. We used to think, that this is a new phenomenon. They used to dry them. They used to take fruits. They would take whatever fruits, like apples, pears, peaches, whatever they were growing, and they would put them on, cut them, thinly slice them, and put them on a catgut, like a fishing wire, and string them right across their attics or the upstairs in their barn. And as the heat rose, it would dry this out, and then they would have dried fruit. Then they'd put those in kegs. And just like the fruit in your health food store, they'd have all winter long, all spring, till the next harvest, they'd have all this dried fruit. And they had an apothecary. They always knew which 50 or 100 herbs to grow that would help them with any illness. And they would put that in their food to prevent illnesses. And they always had fresh pressed cider. And they had different balms they would make to put on sore joints. Look, I remember as a kid, I don't know if you ever had one, I remember when I came home from school one day and there was a kind of a whole flu going around in an upper respiratory tract. My mother gave me a mustard plaster. She took mustard and horseradish and mixed it into a vapor rub and put it on my chest. It burnt, it stunk, but I didn't get sick. And they would give us cod liver oil every morning. Remember, my mother gave us, open your mouth. I hated it. She'd chase me around the house to finally get me. Open my mouth and force that in. I hated it. But now we know cod liver oil is great. So when you look back, and an onion a day, they ate onions all the time. I remember having a mustard plaster on my forehead. Started to get a temperature, put a onion plaster. She'd make an onion plaster, put a poultice with onion and garlic, bring right down the temperature. So we can't assume that people who had survived into old age, and go back and look 250 years ago at the Signers' Declaration of Independence, look how many of them were over 90. And they weren't, could you imagine how long they would have lived had they had vitamins and juices and an exercise program? Right?